You pressed play, but something else might be listening too. Can I ask you something? Where are you right now? And what time is it there? Tell me in the comments. Just don't listen too closely. Some things hear it when you do. It had been just over a year since the sea had taken his only child. Not a war, not disease, not age, just one moment, one shadow beneath the surface. The memory had remained sharpened by time, not dulled by it, as if each wave that crashed along the nearby shore repeated that moment again and again, like an echo caught in tide. The boy's name had been Caleb. He had turned 18 that week. There had been no grand celebration, just a quiet dinner, a few of his closest friends, and a single wrapped gift set beside a pie his father had tried, awkwardly, to bake. His mother would have made it better. She had known how to mark a birthday, but she had not been there. She had been gone for 8 years now, her car destroyed in a head-on collision with a delivery truck driven by someone too drunk to understand direction or speed. Her name had been Elaine. Her absence had shaped both father and son in different ways. One had hardened, the other had softened, but both had learned to move forward, clumsily, quietly, one day at a time. Caleb had grown into a boy with wide eyes and calloused hands. He had fallen in love with the sea not long after his mother's death, first from the rocks, then from the docks, then finally, with a rod in hand and boots planted on the pier. He had learned how to listen to the water, to wait. He had been good at waiting. The gift had been a fishing rod, not a cheap one, not a toy, a real piece of craftsmanship, light, balanced, sea-ready. It had been meant for their trip, a week away, just the two of them, just like old times, back when silence between them had meant comfort, not distance. The place chosen had been a quiet inlet, several hours down the coast, far from the city, far from everything. The boat had not been new. Its hull had once been painted a deep forest green, but most of the paint had peeled now, exposing wood that had softened at the edges. It had belonged to the grandfather once, then the father, then passed down again. It had no name, no modern system of navigation, only a small cabin, 2 bunks, and a stubborn will to keep floating. It had been enough. They had arrived just past 9. The truck had been unpacked, the tackle organized, the rods rigged and baited, the cooler filled. The water had been calm, a strange sort of calm. No gulls, no wind, just silence. Hooks had been dropped around noon. Within minutes, Caleb had felt something tug. A shout had rung out, fish, though the exact word had blurred in the father's memory. He had turned to see his son gripping the rod, bent backward with a force that had nearly dragged him to the edge. Then the snap. The line had broken. Caleb had fallen hard onto the deck, striking the back of his head against the railing. Blood had not flowed. Just a scrape, just a moment. "I'm good," the boy had said, wiping sweat from his brow. A grin had followed, and then they had laughed. Dinner that night had been the first time in years they'd eaten side by side without distraction. Fried fish, instant grits, a quiet toast. The boy had said, "This is the best birthday I've ever had." The father had believed him. At 1:03 a.m., something had gone wrong. The sound of splashing had come first, then shouting. Water had begun to rise beneath the floorboards. One of the hull boards, old, worn, forgotten, had given way beneath pressure. A crack had opened wide enough to invite the sea in. By the time the flashlight had been found, the water had already reached their ankles. The pumps had failed. The raft had been gone. No flares had been packed. No radio had worked. The phone had no signal. Only 2 options had remained: stay and sink, or swim. They had chosen the sea. The water had been colder than expected, thicker. Each stroke had felt like pushing through syrup. The stars had offered no guidance, no moon, no light, only breath, and the sloshing rhythm of arms moving forward, desperate to stay above. An hour had passed, maybe more. Then came the bump, not gentle, not an accident. A force, massive and unseen, had pressed against the father's leg, sending him sideways in the water. A gasp had escaped his mouth. Then silence. Caleb had been just ahead, visible only as a shifting silhouette in the darkness. Then a scream. The scream had not sounded human at first. It had torn through the quiet sea like a lightning strike, high-pitched, cracked, and animal in its rawness. It had been a sound born from pain and terror, something that could not be rehearsed, something that could only be born in the final moments of a life. The father had surged forward, arms cutting through the water faster than he had ever moved in his life. His own voice had joined the night, calling Caleb's name over and over. At first, no reply had come. Then suddenly, the water had thrashed again ahead of him, and another scream had broken the stillness. Help had been shouted, or something like it. But by then the sea had already turned red, thick and warm. The blood had begun to bloom around the boy's silhouette. It had curled into the water in great spirals, unnatural and dark against the moonless surface. The father had reached him too late. He had reached only limbs, a body no longer whole. There had been something else in the water. It had not been seen, but it had been felt. A texture against the skin, coarse and unrelenting, like wet sandpaper. Then the pressure, gripping, pulling, rolling. A shape had moved beneath him, massive and smooth. Teeth had not been seen, but they had been heard. The crunch, a sound unlike anything else, like wood snapping and wet rope tearing, like bones being stripped from life. The father's fists had slammed down into the water blindly, striking whatever mass held his son, over and over, wild and useless, until something gave way, and then the resistance was gone. So was the boy. The water had been left empty, but for red foam and stillness. Floating alone, the father had called into the night. No answers, only the distant slap of waves and his own heartbeat hammering in his chest. His mind had refused to process. There had been no time, only survival. Somehow, his body had continued moving. The shore had appeared faintly around dawn. Every stroke had burned. Every breath had tasted of salt and copper. When his feet had found sand again, they had collapsed beneath him. He had crawled up the beach, hands torn, shirt soaked, hair stiff with salt. The first light of morning had shown what the night had done. His son's blood, drying now, had painted his skin, and there upon the sand, the father had wept until his throat gave out. No body had been found, only fragments, a shredded wetsuit, one shoe, a clump of hair that had once curled above Caleb's left ear. The coroner's report had been brief, presumed attack by a large marine predator, likely species Carcharodon carcharius, a great white. The words had meant nothing to the father. What had meaning was the empty bed, the untouched fishing gear, the photographs still hung in the hallway, the voicemail messages still saved on the phone. Weeks had gone by without sleep. The sound of crunching bone had played on repeat in the silence of the house. The father's hands had refused to heal properly, nails blackened, knuckles swollen. His grip had begun to tremble. His eyes had hollowed. Food had become an afterthought. Conversation, a burden. Only the sea had called to him now, not for pleasure, not for peace, but for reckoning. He had begun to dream of it, dark and endless, a mouth wide and waiting. One night, a voice had returned in his dream, not a stranger's, his son's, but not like before, deeper, wetter, distorted like sound carried through water. It had whispered a sentence, over and over, from somewhere behind him. Not a warning, not a plea, just a statement, repeated endlessly. You left me there, The father had woken screaming. The boat's wreckage had washed ashore 2 weeks later. Pieces only. Fragments of hull, bits of railing. A single bunk cushion, all crusted with salt, chewed by barnacles, split at unnatural angles. Inside one piece, something had been found, wedged in tight, a single tooth, roughly 3 inches long, jagged, yellowed, ancient. It had not belonged to any living species currently. A marine biologist consulted by the authorities had said, "It's likely a fossil that dislodged, common in those waters." The father had not believed them. That tooth had been warm when held, still wet, still bleeding. He had kept it, wrapped in cloth, locked in a drawer. Sometimes it had rattled on its own, as if something far away had remembered what it was once part of. The days had started to bleed into each other. The father had stopped marking calendars. He had stopped answering calls. The mail had piled up outside his door, unopened, untouched. Inside the house, the air had grown stale, thick with the scent of old salt and unwashed grief. Photographs had been turned face down. Mirrors had been covered. Still, the sea had remained, always audible in the distance, always pushing itself forward across the shore. It hadn't stopped since that night. It had come closer, not visibly. No floods or storms, but sensed, as if the tide had remembered the boy's name, as if it had grown bold enough to enter the house. Drop by drop, the dreams had begun to change, no longer confined to the boat or the waves. They had shifted into the house itself. In the dreams, the hallways had become flooded, knee-deep in cold, dark water. The light bulbs had flickered like bioluminescent fish, casting sickly green light across warped floors. Each door had led back to the same place, the ocean, still, dark, and endless. Sometimes Caleb had stood there, not as a boy, but as something else, still shaped like his son, but hollowed, pale, and wet, eyes wide and unfocused, lips parted like he'd been screaming underwater for years. Other times, he had been heard, behind walls, beneath floorboards, scraping, like fingernails on wood, like something trapped. The father had begun sleeping with the lights on. It had changed nothing. One morning, around 4 a.m., a noise had been heard from the kitchen, a low, drawn-out, dragging sound, like something heavy moving across tile. The father had gotten up, slow and unsure, and stepped into the hallway. The air had smelled of algae. The floor had been damp. When he'd reached the kitchen, there had been nothing, just the open fridge door. A trail of wet footprints led to it, bare feet, far too large to be his own. Webbed, he had shut the fridge, locked every door, sat in the living room until sunrise, a knife gripped in his shaking hand. It had been later that same day when he returned to the drawer, the one where the tooth had been kept. He had meant to throw it into the bay, or bury it deep, or break it with a hammer. But when the cloth had been unwrapped, the tooth had been gone. In its place, a sliver of scale, translucent, iridescent, still glistening, as if freshly shed. The nightmares had begun creeping into daylight. While drinking coffee, the walls had pulsed faintly, just once, as though breathing. While brushing his teeth, he had seen Caleb's face in the fogged bathroom mirror, mouth open in silent scream, before it vanished. While doing nothing at all, the hum of the refrigerator had morphed into a distant, low-frequency moan. Then the water had started dripping, from outlets, from ceiling corners, from beneath closed doors. Not clear, not clean, thick, slightly red. It had smelled of rust and decay. Tests had shown nothing unusual. Plumbers had found no leaks. But still, it had dripped, drip, 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 drip. One afternoon, A knock had echoed through the house, not on the front door. From the bathroom wall, 3 slow knocks, then silence, then again, louder. The wall had been struck in return, nothing. Then as he had walked away, a single wet handprint had appeared on the glass of the hallway window. High, far too high to have been made by anyone inside. And then came the voices. Only one word, again and again. Swim. The father had stopped sleeping altogether. He had begun piling furniture against the doors, taping crosses over light switches, filling every room with salt and burning sage, until the walls looked stained with smoke. None of it had helped. The dreams had become memories. The memories had become hallucinations, and the hallucinations had become real. He had started to hear breathing in the sink drain. He had started to hear the screams again. Caleb's voice, rising and rising until it broke into static and sobbing. One night, the bathroom mirror had cracked from the inside. When the pieces had fallen away, the reflection had remained, standing, smiling, bleeding. And then on the 1-year anniversary, the ocean had come home. It had started as mist. Then the floor had gone cold. Then came the sound, deep and layered, like something ancient speaking through thousands of gallons of pressure. The air had thickened. The walls had groaned. And then the front door had opened on its own. The ocean had stepped into the house, not as a wave, not as a flood, but as a presence. It had moved like mist at first, curling over floorboards, climbing the staircase, pressing gently into the gaps between breath and thought. Then the water had followed, slow, deliberate, like a tide choosing its victim. The father had stood in the living room, frozen, watching the shoreline of brine creep toward his bare feet. Every instinct had urged him to run, but there had been nowhere left to go. Every door had opened to salt, of every window had turned to glass, so thick with condensation, it had become opaque. From the kitchen sink, water had begun to bubble, not boiling, pulsing, and from beneath the floor, the knocking had returned, 3 times, and then again, faster, desperate. Something had wanted in, or out. In the hallway, the photographs had begun to peel themselves from the walls. Their colors had washed out, faded by salt and memory. One by one they had fallen to the wet ground, curling into themselves like dried leaves. All except for one, the last photo taken of Caleb, the one with the fishing rod, smiling beside his father, unaware of what waited for him beneath the waterline. That one had remained fixed in place, though now his face had changed. His eyes had been opened too wide. His smile had been twisted, lips torn at the corners, stretched impossibly far. And from the edge of the frame, something had appeared, a dark fin, barely visible. The father had stepped into the flooded hallway. Water had reached his ankles, then his knees. Each step had felt heavier, as though the weight of the past now clung to his limbs like chains. At the end of the hall, the bathroom door had stood open. Inside, the tub had been full, overflowing, bubbling. The same song had been playing again, the lullaby Elaine had sung to Caleb as a baby, only slower, deeper, in reverse. And there in the tub, something had waited, a shape curled into itself, not quite a boy, not quite human. It had risen slowly, arms too long, jaw unhinged, skin translucent, with pale red veins webbing through it like cracks in glass. Its eyes had glowed with ocean light. The creature had opened its mouth. From within had come a voice. The father had known since birth, Caleb's, but no longer warm, no longer whole. The words had spilled out, waterlogged and brittle. You let go. You watched. You heard me scream. You floated while I sank. The father had collapsed to his knees. The water had reached his chest. It had filled his lungs with every breath. He had begged, whether out loud or in silence, He couldn't remember. For forgiveness, for an ending, for a second chance, for anything other than the truth. But the truth had already arrived. It had been living in the corners of the house for a year. It had grown hungry. The house had been found empty 3 days later. No signs of forced entry. No signs of violence. Only water damage. Localized, inexplicable, and bone deep. All the mirrors had been shattered. All the photographs gone, except for one. A photo of a man and his son beside a boat. The son's face had been missing, scratched out from the inside of the glass, done beneath the floorboards. The tooth had been found again, still bleeding, still warm. This time, no longer alone. 5 more had been discovered in a circle beneath what once had been the father's bedroom, arranged like the points of a compass, as if something had marked the house for return. They say the shoreline nearby is unsafe now, not because of currents, not because of tides, but because of how quiet it's become. No gulls, no waves, no wind, only water that doesn't reflect sunlight quite right. And sometimes, in the early morning, footprints can be seen in the sand, leading from the ocean to the houses along the coast. Bare feet, webbed, bleeding. Three months had passed since she had been buried, and yet the calls kept coming. There had been nothing particularly cinematic about the death. No murder, no warning signs, no unsolved mystery, just a moment, a breath missed, a foot misplaced, and a life ended. Her body had been found before dawn, twisted unnaturally at the foot of the stairs in their quiet home. One arm had been draped above her head, fingers curled like she'd been reaching for something. Her lips had turned a faint shade of blue. Her neck had bent in the wrong direction. For a few seconds, it had been assumed that she was playing another of her strange, unfunny pranks. Then the silence had stayed too long. Then the skin had felt too cold. Then the stiffness had been noticed. The medical team had arrived quickly, but far too late. Death had been ruled accidental. A fall, nothing more. No foul play, no suspicious signs, just a missed step during the night. Perhaps on the way to the bathroom, perhaps not. The husband had stood alone as the police quietly zipped her body into the dark nylon bag. No words had been formed. No prayers had been said. The funeral had taken place 7 days later, with her family handling the arrangements. He had been too dazed to speak, let alone organize anything. Her mother had wept silently. Her father had stood like a statue carved from regret. 7 years of life together, vanished in one silent moment. The weeks that followed had felt unreal. Not numb, but distant, like being submerged beneath water that dulled all sound and sensation. Mornings had arrived without her weight in the bed. Evenings had passed without her laughter from the next room. The house had grown hollow. Grief had no script, no guide, only waves. Each time the phone had buzzed, a jolt of mistaken hope had hit the chest, reflexive, stupid, cruel. Old messages had been reread obsessively. Her photos had been stared at until the eyes burned. And one night, in a fit of longing and whiskey, her number had been dialed just to hear her voice again. The voicemail had answered, her voice still light, still alive. The regret from that moment had never faded, because that was when the dreams had started. At first, they had been vague, just darkness, not sleep, not waking, but something in between, an ink-black world with no ground and no sky, floating, trapped, and in that void, a faint sound, a pulsing, steady beat, like a heart buried in the walls. Then the sound had grown, other noises had joined, a distant wailing, high-pitched, unnatural, like a baby's cry stretched too long and far. The sound had filled the ears, pressed against the skull. Breath had become impossible, and always just before breaking, the dream had ended, because that's when the phone would ring. Always the same ringtone, a song once shared between them, assigned only to her contact, and always at the same time, 4:47 a.m. No variation, no exceptions. Each time the phone had been grasped with trembling hands, and each time the screen had shown nothing. No missed call, no number, no record, just silence again, and the knowledge that it had been real. The first time it had happened, sleep had still been shallow, soaked with grief. The ringtone had startled him into consciousness, disoriented, but certain. He had called back, no answer, not surprising. Then again, and again, dozens of times. When the call log had been checked, only his own outgoing calls had been listed. No incoming call had been registered, no trace of the song that had woken him. An error perhaps, a hallucination. But then it had happened again, the next night, and the next, every time. 4:47 a.m. The dreams, the call, the silence. It had become ritual. Eventually, the old phone had been searched for. Hers, a desperate need to hold it again, to feel it in the hand, to scroll through photos and texts, and perhaps, just perhaps, confirm that none of this had truly been happening. But the device had been missing, not in the bedroom drawers, not among the boxes of her things, not even in the places avoided since her death, the places that still smelled like her. The entire room had been ransacked, old clothes pushed aside, personal papers scattered across the bed, receipts, notebooks, envelopes from a clinic no longer remembered, but no phone. She had taken it with her. After that realization, the dreams had become worse. The black space had begun to shift, no longer empty but now trembling. The beat had grown louder, the cries closer. Shapes had moved in the darkness, too far to see, too close to ignore. And then one morning, with shaking hands, the husband had driven to see her parents. They had been the last to touch her body, the final ones to see her face before the casket closed. It had been them who had added her favorite books, her necklace, her wedding ring to the grave. And yes, the phone. They had thought it kind, a way for her to stay connected. After all, it had been something she never left behind. It had been placed in her hands, between her fingers as she had been lowered into the earth. And now it was calling. The drive back from her parents' house had felt longer than before. The sky had dimmed too early, and the radio had been left off. No noise had been welcome, not when silence itself had become a familiar guest. Not when silence now came laced with dread. It had been confirmed. She had been buried with her phone, held in her hands beneath polished wood and 6 feet of soil. And yet the ringtone had continued. Every night at precisely 4:47 a.m. her song, their song, always the same melody, curling out from the dark and clawing at sleep. Always just long enough to wake him completely, never long enough to answer. No calls had ever appeared in the phone log, no missed notifications, just the sound, and then the void. From that point forward, the nights had grown worse. Whiskey had become ritual, half a bottle before sleep, a desperate attempt to sink deeper than the dreams could reach. It had never worked. The black world had always returned, and now it pulsed. The space had begun to breathe, swelling and collapsing, as if something massive lurked beyond the edges of perception. The beat, once steady and distant, had taken on a rhythm far more human, like a heart pounding against walls of flesh. And then had come the voice, not hers, but something near enough to make the blood run cold, soft, whispered, incomplete, words not quite formed, syllables cut short, as if speech had been forgotten and remembered all at once. He had screamed in the dream, but no sound had come. The darkness had closed in tighter. Then always the song, ringing out like a lifeline pulled from an open grave. The days had grown thinner, appetite lost, conversations avoided. People had begun to step back. Coworkers had stopped checking in. Neighbors had learned to nod quietly and move on. Friends had retreated behind text messages left unanswered. The world did not wait, and he did not follow. Only one thing had remained constant: the call. One evening, as the sun set behind the skeletal trees beyond the window, a decision had been made. The cemetery had been visited for the first time since the burial. A simple stone had marked her grave. No flourishes, no quotes, just her name, her birth and death. Fresh flowers had been laid by someone recently, a gesture not his. He had stood alone, staring, then dropped to his knees. The soil had felt colder than expected, damp, yielding. Hands had begun to dig, not in madness but in resolve, a need for proof. The phone could not have rung, not from here, not through earth and decay. Fingernails had cracked, skin had split. The digging had continued until a shout had broken the air behind him. A groundskeeper, alarmed, demanding explanation. He had been escorted out, but not before he had seen it. One corner of the casket, exposed, and around it something impossible, indentations, from the inside. That night no whiskey had been poured. The dream had arrived earlier than usual. The darkness had not waited for sleep to take full hold. It had dragged him in. This time the blackness had shimmered. Figures had begun to emerge, half seen, twitching just beyond clarity. Their movements had been unnatural, flickering, reversed, as if watching a film played backwards at wrong speed. In the center of the void, a chair had stood, a figure seated upon it, her silhouette, but wrong. Too long, too still. The hair had flowed unnaturally, floating without air, and then her head had turned, the face blank, no eyes, no mouth, only a phone held in her hands, and the ringtone, not from the dream, from the real world, dragging him out of the black. 4:47 a.m. Again, the same melody, the same name on the screen. This time, the call had been answered. The phone had not responded. The ringtone had continued, spilling from the speaker even as the answer button had been pressed. No voice had come, only static, and behind it, breathing, deep, wet, slow, as if lungs filled with soil, still strained to draw air. The phone had been thrown across the room. It had landed screen down, but the song had kept playing. When morning came, the battery had read 100%. The screen had shown no missed calls, and the wallpaper had changed. Now it had been her, but not a photo he remembered taking. In the image, she had stood at the bottom of the stairs, face turned upward, mouth slightly open, eyes wide and distant, and in the corner of the frame, her hand holding the phone. The wallpaper had not been altered. The photo had not been found in the gallery. No trace of it had existed among the albums. No file, no metadata, no record. And yet, every time the screen had lit up, her image had remained. That moment, frozen in time, her eyes locked onto something above her. A silent plea, half formed on her lips. That hand, half clenched around the very same phone now displaying her. The floor beneath her feet had looked familiar, too familiar. It had been their hallway, but the wallpaper in the image had been wrong. Floral patterns, long torn down, paint that hadn't been there in years. The photo had shown the house not as it was now, but as it had been long ago, as it had looked when they first moved in, before the renovations, before the accidents, before the rot. The phone had remained untouched for the rest of the day, tucked inside a drawer beneath socks and dust. Still, the screen had lit up every hour, as if summoned by unseen hands. Each time, the image had grown slightly darker, shadows had stretched, her figure had begun to blur. That night, the whiskey had not helped. The dream had returned in force. This time, the chair had been gone. Only her body had remained, standing upright in the darkness, and in her chest, where her heart should have been, an empty space had pulsed, ringed with a circle of blinking lights. From the void inside her, a call had echoed, the song, slowed, distorted, like something underwater dying. And as she stepped closer, the walls of black around him had cracked. He had awoken with blood on his pillow. Nosebleed. Again, or maybe not. The stain had been too dark, too thick, and the scent, metallic, but not human. The house had begun to change. It had started subtly, lights flickering at precise intervals, always in threes, cabinets left open in rooms never entered, footsteps overhead when he had been alone on the top floor, mirrors fogged over from the inside, as though someone had exhaled against the glass. And always, her ringtone, never from the phone, sometimes from the wall, sometimes from the drain, once from the empty space between two shut windows. At 4:47 a.m., the call had arrived again. This time, the wallpaper had changed once more. Her face had been closer, eyes fully open, unblinking, and behind her, in the hallway, something else, a shadow taller than the doorway, indistinct, but watching. The next day the attic door had been found open. It had always been closed tight. No one had been up there in years. Cobwebs had blocked the entrance. Old nails had held the wooden hatch firm, but that morning, it had hung ajar, swaying slightly despite the still air. A ladder had been fetched. Hesitant steps had been taken. Up into the dark, the attic had smelled of mold and moths. The insulation had long since curled away from the beams, and in the farthest corner, her suitcase, the one she had taken on their last trip together, the one that had been buried, still zipped, still intact. No dirt, no decay. Inside, clothes folded perfectly, untouched, and her phone, screen on, battery full, a call in progress, the number his own. He had fled, left the attic door open, locked himself in the bedroom. Her voice had begun to echo from the vents. Not words, not speech, just breath, rhythmic, heavy, a kind of weeping in reverse. That night, sleep had refused to come. At 4:47 a.m., the phone had rung again, despite being powered off. When turned back on, the screen had shown no missed calls, just the new wallpaper, a photo of him, sleeping, taken from the foot of the bed. The photograph had shown him, as he slept, mouth slightly open, one arm draped over the side of the bed. But something else had stood out far more, a second figure, at the edge of the frame, too close, too still. The face had not been visible, only a sliver of long colorless hair, and the pale outline of a shoulder. But the angle had been impossible. It had been taken from within the room, and he had lived alone. No other explanation had made sense. Not a trick, not grief, not delusion. Something had been watching him. The days that followed had collapsed into one another. Sleep had been avoided altogether. Food had gone untouched. The walls had begun to breathe. Shadows had no longer waited for the dark. They had spilled into the daylight, stretching long and slow like fingers across the walls. Each mirror in the house had begun to tremble faintly, reflecting things that should not have moved, and the calls now more frequent. 4:47 had remained the anchor, but now came others. 2:03, 3, 15, 121, each one bringing the song, each one ringing from a different location inside the house. Sometimes it had echoed from the basement door, other times from beneath the bed, and once from the old refrigerator in the garage, long unplugged, rusted shut. The phone itself had remained locked in a drawer, powered off, battery removed. It no longer mattered. The source had never been the phone. Not really. One night, in a half-lucid haze, he had approached the staircase, the place where it had all begun. Each step had felt colder than the last, as if descending into a space no longer part of the world. At the base, the air had shifted, thicker. Still, the lights had refused to turn on, and there, at the edge of his vision, something had waited. Her shape, not quite human, not quite memory. The air had shimmered around her like heat, rising from asphalt, and in her hands, still, the phone. It had rung. This time, no melody, just silence. An invitation. The burial site had been visited once more, not out of defiance, not out of courage, only surrender. The earth had remained undisturbed, the stone unchanged, but beneath the surface, the calling had grown louder. The dreams had bled into waking life. There were no longer lines between sleep and awareness, no longer a difference between memory and presence. He had begun to feel her fingers against his skin at night. He had begun to hear her breath beside his own. Sometimes, her voice would hum fragments of the song. Sometimes, he would find new photos in his gallery of places he had never visited, of rooms that did not exist, of himself, asleep in different beds. And then came the final night. The ringtone had returned at 4:47 a.m., but it had not come from the phone. It had come from the walls, from inside them. The entire house had vibrated with it, each beam and brick and nail singing the same cursed melody. He had risen without thinking. The front door had been open. The street outside had been empty. No stars, no moon, just black sky, like velvet pressed against the world. And in the driveway, his car, driver's side door, open. Inside, her phone, lit, unlocked. A single text message on the screen. 5 words. You never answered the call. He had climbed inside, closed the door. The car had started on its own. The radio had switched on, playing nothing but static. And then her voice, no longer distant, no longer broken, just her, whispering, one sentence, repeated softly, over and over. Now you'll never leave. The car had rolled forward, and the street had vanished behind it. They say the house still receives calls every night at 4:47 a.m. The new owners have disconnected the line, have replaced their phones, have moved their bedroom to the 2nd floor, but still, the ringtone plays. Always the same song, always from nowhere, and sometimes, when the static clears, a voice can be heard beneath it. A man's voice, begging,